One of the things I like to make sure everybody knows about this place right off the bat is that this is the Southeast Missouri Lead District, is the premier lead mining district of the United States. The 106th year that Missouri has been the leading lead producing state in the United States, and that's pretty much of an unheard of number, that one mining district dominates production of an important metal like lead for 100 consecutive years. We've done that. Most of those years we produced 80+% of the United States lead. The high years were in the mid-1980s at 92.5%, so nobody else really counts for a whole lot. We're pretty much it. And there's only one other lead deposit in the world comparable to this. That's Broken Hill, New South Wales in Australia. And we have a very long and interesting history and a significant importance to the state and to the country, actually, that we love to talk about here at the historic site. Lead mining started here in the 1700s, about 1720, a little bit south of us at Fredericktown, Mine Lamont. We had a couple of hundred experienced French miners and smeltermen with black African slaves doing a lot of the work. They were part of a corporation in France called the Mississippi Company, with shareholders all over France and Europe. So it was actually a really big deal. We're not talking about a couple fur trappers digging some spare lead. That already happened in the 1690s. This is 300 people mining lead in this area in 1720. And I can tell you that in 1720, there's not a single town, village, fort, anything in the state of what's now the state of Missouri. All the action in the middle Mississippi Valley was on the Illinois side. Fort Kaskaskia, Mission Church at Cahokia, Fort Deschartres. And these miners were working out of Fort Deschartres. They came over to Missouri to mine lead. They were also farming the Mississippi bottoms on the Illinois side, fur trapping, and all of this merchandise was going back to Europe. So mining actually started here in 1720 on a fairly large scale, and I would say it's of national significance. I don't know of any other industrial venture, mining certainly of this scale, anywhere between the West Coast and the New England colonies in 1720. Big company mining starts here in 1864, and that would be the St. Joseph Lead Company. They were a New York stock company organized specifically to mine lead in Missouri. They started at Bonne Terre, which, interesting name, Bonne Terre in French means good earth. I assure you it's not for the agricultural qualities. It's because there was chunks of lead ore sticking out of the good earth. And St. Joe started there in 1864. Their success generated a lot of attention. So by 1900, there's like 5 other big companies operating here. And I always like to throw in that it was always a big company mining district. 6 big companies, maybe a dozen smaller guys that got absorbed pretty quickly. And that's in stark contrast to, say, the Joplin Tri-State Zinc Lead Mining District in southwest Missouri, where there were hundreds of small companies that didn't get organized till very late in the game. So just a few big companies. And St. Joe Lead was always the most successful, or in a few cases a little luckier than the others. And by the middle of the Depression, they had bought everybody else out. So it was a one-company mining district after the middle of the Depression, after 1933. One of the things that's of interest here, a lot of people, ask, I've actually had people ask questions about, would this community have been better off if these mining companies weren't here? I mean, the reason these communities are here is because there's a lead deposit here, a big lead ore deposit, one of the 2 biggest in the world. So all of these towns early on, as the mines were opened up, we're talking 1860s, 70s, 80s, people couldn't jump in their car and drive 20 or 30 miles back and forth to work every day. So their housing was built up right around the mine shafts. So the mines were kind of the center of the communities. And in fact, some of them, like if you had number 10 mine shaft, it might be number 10 town. Or sometimes they were kind of ethnological names after the people who lived in there. So there was like a Finn town, where mostly Finnish mine workers worked. And in the early days, there was some ethnic diversity here. Cornish miners in Bonne Terre. The Cornish miners in the late 1800s were like the premier miners in the world. They had been mining in the tin mines in Cornwall, England for hundreds of years. They had a college of mining in Truro, Cornwall, and so they expanded all over the United States and into the western United States. They had the knowledge of how to do complicated kinds of mining. So we had a fair number of them early on. That ethnical group doesn't exist that I know of in any great amounts in the state of Missouri. Also, at the turn of the century, we had a big influx of Eastern European miners that worked here in the mines. As might be expected, as I said, this was basically a one-company mining district after 1933. As might be expected, the companies played a very significant role in pretty much everything that was going on in the communities, and especially the St. Joseph Lead Company, since they were the dominant and then only company here for 108 years. And they were these were not truly company towns by definition. The company was heavily involved, and all of the companies actually were heavily involved with what was going on in the community. So they, just to throw out their involvement, they owned all the railroads. There were 3 railroads here. St. Joe Lead Company owned all of them. They were your water company, so they were pumping water out of the mines. They put in water distribution lines. We have in our collections wooden pipes from Leadington and from Park Hills here that the company put in to distribute water back in the 1800s. They were your power company. Each mine had its own power plant in the early days. This building we're in here was the power plant for this mine. And the lead companies not only were generating power for their own use, they were providing all the residential power in these communities in the early days. So this power plant provided power for Flat River, the one at River Mines for there, the one at Leadwood for there, Deloge, Bonne Terre. All of those mines at those places, the power plants at those mines were providing the residential power. And this went until 1930. About 1930, St. Joe found themselves, as they bought the other companies, they found themselves running all these power plants and thinking not very efficient. So they went to Union Electric, now Ameren, of course, basically said, look, we're just going to mine lead or we'll buy power from you. And Union Electric would have said, well, thanks, but we don't have that much to sell. Give us a few years. So the lead mines here are actually responsible for Lake of the Ozarks. Bagnell Dam was built by Union Electric specifically for this project. This was the dollar project that built Bagnell Dam. So when Bagnell Dam went online in 1930, all the power plants here were shut down. And Union Electric history says that that was the biggest electrical contract ever led in the U.S. up till that time, because it wasn't for just the industrial power for the lead industry, it was for all the residential power in St. Francis County, except for Farmington. They took that all over. So the companies were involved in in production of electricity. They bought firefighting equipment for these communities. They supported schools. We had one time a lecture given by the son of one of the regional supervisors. He said every year his dad, at the end of the school year, would call all the school districts, ask how they had come out. If they were in the red, this company would just write a check to cover the cost. They also played a major role in the development of the Votech Center here. I think it was their idea, and I think they funded initially part of it to provide knowledge or experience for students that would possibly do the jobs they had available in the mining industry. They were into recreation. They actually had a lyceum, here's a word you don't hear much today, in Bonne Terre in 1860s with an indoor pool and theater and library for company use. They built YMCA buildings in these communities, which they gave to the communities. I know St. Joe, probably not a real important point, but they built the first bowling alley in the area, built the first golf course in the area. So they were into recreation for their employees. They owned many company houses, 1,500, I believe, at one time. that were built for for employees to live in. And I guess one of the points I need to be making about all these things, not only were they involved with all this, they were very tuned in to not imposing upon the individual's rights or lifestyle, and trying to do this as economically as possible. So they weren't like ripping anybody off. This is a common thing in some industries to have company housing, company stores, and basically you're ripping off your employees, maybe making more profit there than you are on your operation. This company never did that, and I'll maybe talk a little more about that later, but they were always, looking out for their employees. They had great interest in community and employee, involvement and well-being. So they had 1,500 company houses. I have rents, and I have charts showing, listing the houses, the street addresses, how many square feet, how many rooms, how big the yard is. They have maintenance schedules. When is the next paint job? When does the next roof get put on? I've actually physically went out and looked to try to find those. Many of those are still there. They weren't shacks. They were, reasonable houses. Have architectural drawings actually for some of the company houses. And then the rents, my rent column, they're like $3 and $4 a month for rent for a company house all the way up to World War II. And then the company, when they got out of the housing business, sold the house to whatever employee was living in at that time for pretty much a pittance, not very much. The other thing that I'm really fond of talking about is company stores. St. Joe Lead Company in about 1890 organized the Bonterre Farming and Cattle Company. This was a subsidiary company that dealt with everything that wasn't specifically mining related or railroads. The railroads were incorporated separately also. And the Bonterre Farming and Cattle Company for years operated, they had large cattle farms. They had beef cattle herds, registered beef cattle herds. That was so successful, they developed a registered dairy herd. They bought the Purity Dairy in Bonterre, so they were in the dairy business also. But they operated 6 retail company stores in the area, one in each of the main towns they did business in. So there's a company store in Flat River, River Mines, Leadwood, Deloge, Bonterre, and Herculaneum. And once again, as I say, this is a very major source of abuse in especially the coal mining industry in the Appalachians. Here it was never that, and we had an unusual situation in Missouri. We had a state mine inspector in the late 1800s that hated company stores, crusaded against company stores, got a law passed in Missouri saying no mining company can operate a store as part of their business. Well, that law was pretty much just circumvented by everybody, including the companies here. All you had to do was your same stockholders and trustees of your mining company would incorporate a store company, and then you would have a cooperative agreement. And in addition to the St. Joe stores, which I know most about, I know very little, but I know that Doe Run Lead Company and the Federal Lead Company both had stores. I have paychecks where the check was cashed at the company stores of those two companies, but I know very little about them. There's not much out there information available. But St. Joe operated 6 retail stores. That same mine inspector, seeing that he could not stop the abuses of company stores, kept reporting on company stores. And one year he comes here and his annual report has a report on, this is his report on the St. Joseph Lead Company store system. And this is almost an exact quote. He says, this year studied St. Joe Lead Company store, 3,000 workmen here getting one of the best deals of any workman in America. The company operates 6 stores. They don't use any scrip. They don't withhold any part of your store account from your pay. All pay is in United States currency in full on payday. Knowing that they also overcharged, usually at company stores, he said, comparison shopped at the private stores in town. Not only are the company stores the cheapest, they have the highest quality merchandise available. This is the company store model the entire world should ascribe to. So rather glorious commentary from a mine inspector who hated company store system. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is the company in pretty much everything they did have always tried to do the best they could do for their employees and the communities they operated in. And it actually says that in their incorporation papers in 1864. It says it will always be our intent to do the best we can do for our employees and the communities we operate in, never do anything to negatively impact them. And I think they've consciously tried to do that for all these years. People in the earlier times did hard work. I mean, they were used to hard work. They accepted hard work as the norm. Like I say, I doubt if you could find anybody to do this job. One shoveler had to fill 21 of those 1-ton ore cars in an 8-hour shift. And I looked up the pay for that in 1900. You're going to get $2 a day for that job. And that $2 a day is about average pay for a laborer in the Midwest in 1900. We're talking a rather hard labor job, but $2 a day was about average pay. The bonus on that job was extremely lucrative. All bonuses here were very good. So you're going to get a quarter for every car over 21. You say a quarter, it doesn't sound like much, but do the math. I mean, you fill 21 of these cars for $2, you can double your pay on 8 more. That will work on your mind all day long. You know, your back and arms are wearing out. Your mind is telling you, if I can just get through the 21 cars, I get to the big money, the quarter cars, I'll make a killing here, you know, make some serious money. And we interviewed a lot of miners here before we were open to the public, and it was not uncommon for them to double their pay. Not every day, but occasionally they could double their pay, or even more than that. So it was, and the other thing interesting about that to me is, I get a lot of people today that'll say, boy, that must have been a horrible job. Those people must have hated this. I started thinking, I don't remember anybody we interviewed saying that. And I looked back at the interviews, and nobody said that. In fact, a few of them said, well, most of them said, you don't have to be very smart to do this job. Any dummy can do this job. You just shovel rock. But it's kind of pleasant. Some of them threw in. You can think about the ball game that night, or where you're going with the family on the weekend. And when the job is over, you leave. It's over. You don't take your job home with you. And then I started looking at it a little further, and you start comparing it with other jobs. So what would this worker have been doing if he weren't working here? He'd probably be doing some kind of heavy construction work, maybe road building or building construction. What do you have there in Missouri? Well, you have 100+ degree days. You have days when it's raining every day and you can't work. You have days with snow up to your knees and you can't work. You have mosquitoes eating on you and bugs flying in your face. It's 56 to 60 degrees every day in the mine here. There's no critters that are bothering you. It's ideal working conditions, and on good days you can maybe double your pay, or maybe even better than that. I mean, how bad a job is that? As mechanization comes in, we leave those hand drilling, hand loading jobs, and we go to equipment, and we have a lot of that equipment on display in our museum here. Probably the next thing after drilling machines that they mechanized was loading machinery. So instead of hand shoveling, they went into machinery to load. And this shovel I'm sitting on is a good example. In fact, it's the most important piece of machinery in this museum. St. Joe Lead and the other companies started mechanizing from the aspect of loading about 1917. And I would say they tried every available machine. That's maybe 3. You know, there's not much out there available. Nothing worked very well. So St. Joe Lead sat down, they had their engineers design this shovel, and it's called the St. Joe shovel. They built 52 of these starting in 1922. They're all serial numbered. This is number 5, built in 1926. And that started the mechanization. So now instead of scooping stuff up with the shovel, you have a guy sitting on a machine loading ore cars. We're now loading larger ore cars. The other thing about mining industry is the equipment keeps, you know, it's more and more mechanized, and the equipment keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So they went from 1-ton ore cars that they were being filled by hand shovels to 2.7-ton cars. And now the operator of this St. Joe shovel And by the way, all my retirees say, this is where you want to be sitting if you're working here at this time. This is the money job. This operator has to fill 40 2.7-ton cars in an 8-hour shift. Retirees tell me anybody any good on this machine can do 80 or 100 in a day. So big time bonus money. And we had one gentleman who gets me aside every year at our open house to remind me that he holds the company record on this job at 203. And I know he's not lying. He couldn't get away with it with all these retirees, and they all give him a bunch of flack. There he is, bragging about his record again, always bragging about the record. But you're only able to do it once. And he's like, that's what records are all about, you know, you only have to do it once. Anyway, and then also in the 20s, they went to, in the early days with the one-ton cars, they were using mules. There's a really great book written by University of Missouri Press, or published by University of Missouri Press, written by the equine studies people. The book, it's part of a series of books on Missouri mules, and the book is called Missouri's Long-Eared Miners, whole book on mine mules. So mine mules in the early days pulled the one-ton ore cars. We use big Missouri mules here. Any of our mules could pull 3 of those one-ton cars. And there were actually mules in the mines here underground all the way till the 1950s. But as things progressed, they went to other types of locomotives. So the earliest ones were compressed air locomotives. There's a photograph of one of those in one of our pictures in the gallery. And then they tried electric battery-powered locomotives briefly. There's one of those in a photograph. And then in 1920, they went to the overhead trolley, electric trolley locomotives, which we have a good example on display. That's a 15-ton locomotive. That means it weighs 15 tons. It could pull 40 2.7-ton ore cars. They didn't usually haul that many, but it could pull 40 2.7-ton ore cars. Works on overhead trolley, just like streetcars that I rode around all the time when I was a kid in St. Louis. 275 volts direct current grounded back through the track. The locomotives, like all other mining machinery, heavily modified. They look nothing like the factory issue. Our big locomotives were made by Goodman Manufacturing in Chicago, like I say, starting in 1920, and those were in use all the way till the end of mining here in 1972. The other interesting piece of machinery I like to talk to people about is the little personnel carriers that they call speeders. There's one in our museum right over here. What's interesting about these again were designed and built by the company. They were all manufactured in the mine. The company had big machine shops at all their surface plants, but they also had underground machine shops. And the main reason for that is you don't want to have to pull this big machinery up and down a mine shaft to work on it. So they had underground shops. This was the major mine here, so this had the biggest underground shop. The machine shop here was 8,000 square feet. Lathes, cutting equipment, bending equipment, welding equipment, blacksmith forges. So the speeders were completely manufactured underground. None of them saw the light of day till a few of them were brought out at the end. They were for actually staff people like mine captains, mine superintendents, geologists, surveyors, electricians, pump maintenance guys. People who had to cover a big part of the mine on any given day had those. One of the other things that I want to make sure people are aware of, I already said that this was the largest or the major lead mining district of the world, or one of the 2 major lead mining districts of the world. My favorite word here, I guess, is enormous. Everything here is enormous. So no matter how you look at this district, if you look at it from tonnage of ore produced, tonnage of metal smelted from that, dollar value of ore produced, employment, physical size of the place, longevity, they're all enormous. So, like I said, we operated here for 108 years. We're at 154 years now, industrialized big company mining. The workforce here at the peak was 4,500 employees in the old lead belt. The physical size of this place is mind-boggling. I've been in many mines, and I have never seen anything quite in this scale. So the mining done here is what the type of mining is called room and pillar mining. That's because the ore is in sedimentary layers of rock. It's not veins that cut across the layers. It's in the sedimentary layers. So when you mine it, you remove the whole layer of rock, and you leave columns of rock spaced out behind you to support the back, the ceiling of the mine. So it's room and pillar. It's like a series, the mine would be a series of giant rooms with big columns of rock spaced out. Well, how big is that? Well, there were 15 main shafts here. Our shaft is, just one of 15. And ours is 500 feet deep. The deepest is 750. That would be the shaft down in St. Joe State Park by the picnic area. But there were 15 of those shafts. I'd say they averaged 400, 350, 400 feet deep. But as St. Joe Lead bought the other companies, they connected all of those mines underground. So when it's all over, it's one mine with 15 different shaft entries. How big? Well, if you'd have gone down our shaft in 1972, you'd have stepped out into a room and pillar mine 13 miles long by 5 miles wide. Most of those rooms, or many of those rooms, are 100 to 150 feet high. There were a few places where the entire thickness of the Bonne Terre Formation was ore, and they mined it clear 300 feet. So there were rooms in this mine, you could build a 30-story building and barely touch the ceiling of the mine. All the haulage was by rail, as I just mentioned, in the later years after 1920s with electric trolley locomotives. When St. Joe Lead quit here, they were maintaining a 300-mile mainline railroad system underground with 15 mainline trains cruising around at any given time. Enormous is the right word. This is just an enormous place. And one last thing I would say about this, all of that is still there, of course, but you can't go there now because it's totally full of water. Like every place else in the Ozarks, enormous groundwater recharge. Every time it rains, much of that rain filters underground, fills up every open space, and this is no different. So the mine is totally full of water. It still is a great resource, even to this day, because this is our water supply for this whole area. And I purposely, to make a point, call it groundwater steeped in lead ore. Of course, DNR public drinking water people test the quality of the water all the time. It's not treated for mineral content at all. It is treated for biological things, so to make sure there's no bacteria or anything like that in it. But I just got the analysis recently, so I know exactly what the lead content is. It's 3.7 parts per billion is what the lead content is. It can be many times higher than that and still be perfectly good drinking water. So it is still, I would say, about 30,000 people. That's our water supply, and you don't have to drill a well. You just, you couldn't miss the mine if you did drill the well. But there's no need. You just bring the pipes up one of the mine shafts and put it into the distribution system.
Hi, I'm Nicole Boyer with the Phi Theta Kappa Honor Society, and I'm here with Mark Hodges at the Missouri Mines State Historic Site. And I would like to ask you, so you were telling me that you had some family members that had worked for the mines. Which mines did your family members work for?
Well, at the time that you have to look at the history, in the early years of the 20th century, there were several individual mining companies in those very early days. But by the mid-1930s, by the middle of the Depression, it was basically one mine company. The St. Joe Company had eventually bought all the mine properties here in this community. And so eventually it was a one company mining community. And over the course of about 20 years or so, the St. Joe Company eventually merged all those individual mines below the surface so that it became one great big giant mine. And I had both my grandfathers worked in the mines in this community. My maternal grandfather, my mom's dad, he worked here in the 1920s, hand loading the old 1-ton ore cars, just with his arms and a shovel. But he was primarily a farmer. He just did that for a short time. My father's dad, he was a career miner with the St. Joe Company. He worked from very early on in the 20th century and retired in 1957. I was born in 56, so I never really knew him as a miner. I just knew him as Grandpa.
So you said hand shoveling. Did you have any family members that worked in the more recent when they had the machinery?
Oh yeah. I've got an uncle who worked over at the community of Doe Run, where St. Joe had some operations. I've still got family today who work for the Doe Run Company. The old St. Joe Company is now known corporately as the Doe Run Company. It's essentially the same company. And I've got a cousin who is an accountant for that company out in the Viburnum area. And my father, briefly, when he and Mom lived in what used to be the town of Flat River. I was born when they lived there for about the first 2 or 3 years of my life. My dad worked briefly in the mines before he moved us to St. Louis.
Okay. Did they like their job?
Most of the mining families here had very good, positive relationships with the company. People here, this was a pretty solid, stable, I would call it a blue-collar working class community. The people here were not rich, but they were comfortable for the most part. Even during the Depression years, when times were hard in so many rural areas, people in this community were kept on the payroll, their jobs were secure, and my father's family, he was raised just outside of town. They had a little bit of extra money. They could afford a movie theater ticket from time to time. They could afford a few extra luxuries and things that other people during the Depression weren't able to do. So the company here took care of people throughout the 20th century. Most of the families that you would talk to, people who grew up here, would tell you that it was a good company to work for.
So that would mean it supported you and your family. Did they have health insurance?
Over time, to varying degrees, benefits would change. You know, of course, in the earliest days, I'm not sure that they would have had all the benefits that we talk about today in our time, but that type of thing changed throughout the passing of the years.
Okay. Here's one. Did they ever talk about any aspects of growth in the towns that they witnessed, or did you witness any growth within the town?
Well, from my perspective in my lifetime, I can see the opposite. I can see how the community declined economically after the mines closed down. I remember as a young person in the 1960s and 70s, first of all, let me explain. We live within the city limits here, you know, right, this museum and state historic site, we're located in the city limits of a community called Park Hills. Park Hills is a recent municipal designation. All of this whole community here, several individual towns with their borders lying next to each other were the mining towns that these mines supported. 4 of those towns in the 1990s, they merged and eliminated their political boundaries to form one larger town that we call Park Hills today. Those 4 towns were the towns of Elvins, River Mines, Esther, and Flat River. Flat River probably being the dominant business district of the region. Well, as a child and as a teenager, even though I lived in St. Louis, we came down here to this area quite a bit because of other family members. I can remember when Flat River, over on the other side of the highway here, West Main Street, was lined with shops, clothing stores, drug stores, 5 and dimes. My aunt ran a dress shop for several years over there. Picture Bedford Falls out of the movie It's a Wonderful Life. Bedford Falls with chat piles. And I can remember how busy it was. Well, when the mine shut down in '72, I'm getting back to the question you asked me. I can see that after the mine shut down in '72, for the next 10 to 15, 20 years, the economy, Flat River, became less and less of a business hub as just to our south, the town of Farmington expanded and it rose to its place in the sun back in the 1980s. It started becoming what Flat River used to be. So to answer your question, I've kind of seen the reverse. I've seen the end of the growth and the diminishing. I guess I would like to emphasize there are a lot of people growing up in this area today who maybe have moved down here from St. Louis or from some other area in another part of the country who are not aware of what went on here in the early years of the 20th century and up through the 1970s. There are people living here who they see what's left of the old tailings piles, or chat dumps as people locally called them here for years. They don't know what they were. They see the old rusted buildings just outside our door here, which was the central mill for several years that processed all the lead ore. They see this old abandoned, haunted looking thing, and they don't know what it is. They don't even realize that we have a museum right here. People, if you talk to anybody my age or older, who grew up in this area, whose family goes back 2 or 3 generations or more, people whose fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers worked in these mines, they've got a very definite sense of pride and a sense of place and a legacy that we like to try and keep alive. This was a big thing for years. There are miles of underground connected mine that lie underneath this entire community. And there were thousands of people who worked here, virtually the entire male workforce for decades. If you were a guy graduating out of high school, you could probably figure on going to work into the lead mines if you didn't join the military or move elsewhere. This was a big thing that made a lot of money and produced a lot of materials for really the entire world. And we like to keep that legacy alive here.
Absolutely. So I guess that means everybody should come here to the Missouri Mines State Historic Site and check it out themselves. What are the big piles of rocks that we see everywhere?
Oh, the chat piles.
Of the highway.
Or, as people around here for years, locally people always called them chat dumps. But basically they're the piles of leftover crushed rock. When the lead ore was brought up to the surface, it was embedded in thousands of tons of rock, and all that had to be crushed down to sand, and then processes were done to separate the lead ore out of all that crushed rock. The leftover rock, or the sand if you want to call it that, or you can call it the chat, which is what people around here for years called it. That, in those very earliest days of the 20th century up until about the 1930s, before they changed processes of disposal, they would use conveyor belts to pile all that crushed rock into these great big giant mounds. And in fact, they used to be taller than what they are today. They've been shortened in size for various reasons in recent times. But these chat piles, for people who grew up here, they're cultural icons. If you talk to anybody who grew up here from the 1940s up through the early 70s, they talk about how they played on them as kids. My dad used to ride his bicycle down the pile out at Deloge. There was one pile in the area where every year people would put a Christmas tree up on top of it, and you could see it lit up at the top of the chat pile. People have ridden sleds down them. Some people have just simply climbed up them and rolled down hundreds of feet. Family reunions, people would get together, and after having a meal on a Saturday or Sunday, they'd say, let's go climb the chat pile. And people don't understand the emotional connection that the people who grew up here have to those things. My mother told me a story back in the 1950s. There was a a young girl from China who came here to go to school on an exchange program. And she made some friends, and they went out driving around one night, and she was asking the kids that she was with, "What are those?" And they would say, "Well, that's a chat dump." And she'd say, "What?" "It's a chat dump." And what she was hearing, she wasn't understanding what they were saying. They thought they were telling her to shut up. But the chat dumps are very iconic figures here in this whole area for people who, they were a way of life for people here for years. And they kind of, if I can say this, there's a lot of negative attention these days, the news media, and there's a lot of people who look at them as just piles of junk. A lot of people who grew up in this area, they kind of roll their eyes at that type of an attitude, because to them there's something special.